Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming to this week's Humanities Forum. This week's forum is co-sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Fellowship, and as many of you already know, the C.S. Lewis Fellowship is a new initiative under the Humanities program whose mission is to promote the dissemination of C.S. Lewis's thought at the secondary and post-secondary level. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Carol Zaleski. Carol Zaleski is the professor of world religions at Smith College. She earned her BA from Wesleyan University and her MA and Ph.D. in the study of religion from Harvard University. She has been teaching philosophy of religion, world religions, and Christian thought at Smith since 1989 and was appointed to the chair in world religions in 2006. Zaleski is the author of Otherworldly Journeys, Accounts of Near-Death Experience in Medieval and Modern Times, and The Life of the World to Come, both from Oxford University Press. She is the co-author with her husband, Philip Zaleski, of The Fellowship, The Literary Lives of the Inklings, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams, Prayer, A History, The Book of Heaven, and, forthcoming, The Book of Hell. For 2 decades, Zaleski contributed a column to the ecumenical magazine Christian Century, sharing the fruits of current scholarship in philosophy, theology, and religious studies, and commenting on the contemporary religious scene. She has also contributed articles and reviews to the New York Times, First Things, America, Second Spring, Nova et Vetera, Communio, Parabola, the Journal of Religion, Religious Studies, and the Journal of the History of Ideas. Her major project at present is a book on belief and doubt with regard to the big questions, God, freedom, and immortality. And the title of her lecture this afternoon is C.S. Lewis's Divine Comedy, The Landscape of the Afterlife, and the Substance of Christian Hope. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Zaleski.
Great, thank you. Father Isaac, thank you all. I'm just really thrilled to be here, and I'm just grateful to you to have thought of inviting me. And it's exciting to hear about all that you're doing in the humanities program, Western civilization, and C.S. Lewis, which all fits together beautifully. All right, so The Landscape of the Afterlife and the Substance of Christian Hope is the subtitle. Yeah, how's that? Is that better? Is that good? All right. Okay, so this is about life after death. Now that's a very counterintuitive idea when you look at it squarely. I mean, it's pretty obvious that the dead stay dead. And this was just as obvious to our ancestors as it is to us. It's not like they had some lack of awareness of death that we suddenly have, and that to account for why they believed in an afterlife and why our society tends to be skeptical about it. The other thing is that the history of experiments to prove the existence of life after death is tainted by fraud and credulity. And philosophical arguments for immortality haven't fared much better. There aren't any really knockdown arguments. There's some suggestive lines of reasoning. The thing is that even if it can be demonstrated that we have immaterial souls, we remain contingent beings. Our non-existence remains always conceivable. My grandmother had a best friend who was a Soviet-era atheist, communist literary critic, and she had a lifelong fixation on finding evidence for human survival of bodily death. And she lived into her 90s, and her journal, which is now in the New York Public Library, it's 88 volumes, well, small volumes, but testify not only to her affair with Theodore Dreiser, that's another subject, but to her desperate hunger for proof of immortality in the absence of a religious worldview. And she, to me, has always been a kind of example of what happens when you become fixated on proof of life after death and you don't have the support of a total picture of the universe in which life after death would be plausible and also wouldn't be the only thing you're interested in, where you have this whole sort of, in a fully realized religion, you have a whole lattice work of doctrines, of commitments, of practices and symbols, not just isolated philosophical arguments or contested empirical findings. And that's where C.S. Lewis comes in, because what he has to say about the afterlife doesn't depend on empirical evidence, and it doesn't depend upon isolated philosophical arguments. He has arguments, but I want to say that really his case for an afterlife rests upon the support of his total religious worldview. In fact, when he first began to believe in God and became a Christian, he had no belief in a future life at first. When he discovered as a Christian that the promise of a future life belongs to the whole tapestry of the gospel, he became one of its sanest and most inventive modern exponents. But he never totally abandoned a certain restraint with regard to speculating about the afterlife. And I think this restraint contributed not just to his sanity and soundness, but also to his imaginative freedom and creativity on these questions. Just to say quickly a few ways in which he worked on these things as a philosopher, where I also see this kind of restraint. He reasserted the claims of common sense moral reasoning. That is the kind of reasoning that's already at work in the young child who says, that's not fair, when someone steals her truck in the playground. Similarly, with regard to belief in a future life, he defended our basic intuitions against a reductionistic naturalism, or you might say scientism, which preemptively rules them out. By arguing that reason itself is evidence that there is something beyond what naturalism considers to be what Lewis called the whole show. He also turned the wishful thinking explanation of belief in a blessed afterlife on its head. You're aware of that, I'm sure. I mean, Freud and others tell us that we're basically hardwired. We can't help believing in an afterlife because at bottom we can't believe in our own death. And when it comes to the death of others, we're conflicted. The other person is kind of part me and part stranger. I don't know what to make of that, so I have to come up with some conception of an afterlife, and it's all wishful thinking. But Lewis took this wishful thinking argument and he turned it on its head by saying that our innate, hardwired yearning for a joy that nothing in this world can supply is a sign that we were made for a blessedness beyond this world. So here there's two arguments, an so-called argument from reason and a so-called argument from desire, and neither of these arguments is unassailable. They have been criticized. They do have their weak spots, but a lot of their power, which they continue to have despite the weak spots, comes from the way Lewis embeds them in very rich accounts with analogies and imaginative, as he put, supposals, which disarm our intellectual and scientific prejudices. These prejudices that block us from being open to possibilities and which make the idea of a future life hard to picture and hard to believe. Just a few quick relevant points about Lewis's life. Clive Staples Lewis, poor guy called Clive. A lot of Lewis fans out there. I haven't met anyone who's naming their kid Clive. He was known to his friends as Jack. He was born in 1898 to a Protestant family in Belfast. He lost his mother when he was young, and he survived an insane schoolmaster only to come of age in a global war, the First World War. Like Tolkien, he saw action in the disastrous Battle of the Somme. He was badly wounded, carried shrapnel in his body for decades, and inherited the burden of living with and caring for a fallen friend's emotionally challenging mother for the rest of her life. Like Tolkien, Lewis found it natural to think that our world is under siege. This is just kind of a basic take on reality that they shared, and that a lot of it was the result of having gone through the First World War, but not just that. They both imagined that our world is under siege and that they, as writers, have a calling which has something to do with recovering, reclaiming from the wreck of our world whatever can be reclaimed and rehabilitated, whatever good things. As a young scholar, Lewis went up to Oxford, began his academic career as a philosophy tutor, and evolved into a historian of medieval and Renaissance English literature at Oxford and towards the end of his life at the University of Cambridge. He was also notably a literary critic and controversialist, a moral satirist. I sometimes think satirist is the first thing to call him. Novelist, fantasist, vigorous walker, nude swimmer, lover of beer, beef, and tobacco, an inveterate bachelor who woke up one day to find himself a family man, and a former atheist who became, during wartime, Second World War, radio broadcast, the public voice of Christian hope. The young Lewis was a romantic in the typical senses of the word. He had an exalted view of the imagination and kind of a cult of artistic genius, fascination with myth and fairy lore, love of all things medieval, mysterious, and unattainable. His great ambition was to be a poet, and his poetry was full of the sort of Promethean romantic spirit, more like Shelley than like Coleridge or Wordsworth. He wrote a tragic drama called Loki Bound, in which the title character who speaks for Lewis kind of shakes his hand at the god Odin, the creator god, saying, "Why should creatures have the burden of existence forced on them without their consent?" It's like people who sue for wrongful birth. I've heard of that. Oh, gosh, it's sad. During his atheist period, Lewis loved the gods as long as they were Norse gods and kept at a safe distance. He loved Milton's Paradise Lost for its fantastic elements, even when he hated Milton's God. He loved Fraser's The Golden Bough because it allowed him to feast on mythology, while viewing Christianity as just one more agricultural myth with one of these corn gods, dying and rising god. He drifted towards William Butler Yeats and his Celtic mysteries, and he was introduced by a school matron to magic, to the occult side of Romanticism. But as he matured, he distanced himself from the kind of Romanticism that lionizes the transgressive genius and disdains conventional rationality. He remained a romantic in his own way, but it would be a romanticism without rebellion. Again, I'm going to now and then just touch down on this idea of restraint in Lewis. As a philosopher, his journey took him, as he put it in a 1934 letter, from materialism to idealism, from idealism to pantheism, God everywhere, from pantheism to theism, and from theism to Christianity. A lot of little hops there. His friend, the anthroposophist Owen Barfield, argued Lewis out of the kind of naive scientific materialism which was keeping him hindered from making those moves. And then his other pals in this group called the Inklings, J.R.R. Tolkien, and an English lecturer named Hugo Dyson, a really hilarious character, actually, overcame Lewis's remaining inhibitions about Christianity during a legendary nighttime walk. They appealed both to the rationalism and the romanticism in Lewis's nature. Very intelligent of them to do that, because he needed both to be satisfied. They persuaded him that the great myths that Lewis had always loved as an atheist and now as a kind of generic theist, that these great myths are not lies, but are truth bearers which prefigure the gospel. Tolkien has a great essay about that on fairy stories. And that Christianity, Tolkien and Dyson hammered this home to Lewis, that Christianity, without losing its mythic character and its mythic splendor, is that myth, that one myth, which became historic fact. But what Tolkien and Dyson didn't do was appeal to a craving for immortality. And Lewis, as I've already kind of suggested, would have rejected such an approach. As he said in his memoir, Surprised by Joy, "My conversion involved as yet no belief in a future life. I now number it among my greatest mercies that I was permitted for several months, perhaps for a year, to know God and to attempt obedience without even raising that question." And he adopted a rather austere maxim, It goes like this. It is more important that heaven should exist than that any of us should reach it. There were some personal reasons for this austerity. He had known an Anglo-Irish priest who basically went insane and was, well, not quite, maybe not quite insane, but he was obsessed, like my grandmother's best friend, with finding evidence for survival of death. And yes, one case of insanity, the brother of his companion, Mrs. Moore, had a psychotic breakdown, and Lewis was present for it. And Lewis attributed it to this person's preoccupation with questions of the occult. And so Lewis concluded from this that that our moral and our mental health depend on restraining preoccupation with other worlds. But then Lewis gives us these fantastic other worlds. He gives us these lush, imaginative adventures in eschatology, the study of last things, such as we find in the Space Trilogy, the Narnian Chronicles, the Great Divorce. I think that initial restraint actually fed his imagination. But mainly it was because he was working within the great tradition of Christianity in its fully realized form, its orthodox form. And that gave him resources that he wouldn't have been able to dream up on his own if he just set out to kind of construct an imaginary world in which people live after death, or there's intelligent beings on other worlds and all of that. So he's part of a great tradition, and the great tradition supports him and frees him. It even carried him through that terrible dark night brought on by his wife's death, when for a time, as he tells us in A Grief Observed, he could neither believe nor practice it. So what I want to do now is follow Lewis as he treats the major elements in Christian hope, particularly concerning the afterlife, the world to come. What we see is that Lewis succeeded in overcoming a whole series of intellectual and even religious vetoes against that hope. Religious vetoes, which is in a way the most interesting. For example, the claim that we shouldn't want an endless life because an endless life would be boring. There's actually a famous essay about this by the philosopher Bernard Williams, that we would run out of life projects after a couple thousand years. But Lewis knows that boredom is in the eyes of the beholder. And the fact that we are the sort of people that are easily bored, restless, easily distracted, is a sign that we need in some way to be transformed. And Lewis believes that transformation is on offer, and he gives us examples of it. One of my favorite is in the Narnian Chronicles, the de-dragoning of Eustace Scrubb. It's a painful process, but it restores the humanity of this child who, for very good reasons, had become a dragon. So there's a de-dragoning on offer by which we can be made the sort of beings who would not be bored, who would be incapable of boredom when we're in the presence of divine glory and the glory of other souls. And Lewis even suggested that a kind of purgatory, we can call it a de-infernalized version of purgatory, is what will complete what is lacking from our de-dragoning in this life. And this life gives us lots of opportunities to have the scales rubbed off and become human, but if there may be more of that needs to happen, that's what purgatory is for. The other religious veto, or at least moral veto, against belief in an afterlife that Lewis counters, is the idea that it's a narcissistic wish to want to go on living for yourself. But what Lewis does, again, turning things on their head, he says that he convinces us in so many of his works that the price of admission to a blessed afterlife is actually death. You don't get there without dying. And that doesn't just mean bodily death, but death to self, death to our self-regard, to our self-pity, to our self-projects. He liked to quote, I hope I'm remembering the words correctly, the maxim of the wonderful Scottish theologian and fantasist George MacDonald, I am my own as the first principle of hell. So the narcissistic approach to an afterlife is actually tending towards hell. And finally, against the claim that it's just too hard for moderns to picture a blessed afterlife. You know, the biblical theologian Rudolf Bultmann had a famous saying about that. People that can turn on electric lights can't believe any of that stuff in the New Testament, that's, you know, miraculous things that happen. It's just not, you know, this is what Lewis learned from his friend Barfield to call chronological snobbery. It's always been hard to picture the afterlife. So in many ways, it's unpicturable. But you could say that Lewis's entire corpus is devoted to helping us visualize the cosmos as the sort of place where life beyond death would make sense. So these are the sort of things I want to explore in what follows. To start with, and I wouldn't be surprised if Michael Ward spoke about this in his talk. I'm not sure what the exact content was, but I have a hunch. But I'll touch on this anyway. In his teenage years, Lewis had soaked up some popular science writing which portrayed the universe as a cold, vast wasteland. Now, nowadays, we don't maybe have exactly that problem, but because we get these gorgeous space telescope photos of the universe, and they inspire awe. But they don't lead anywhere, really. I think Lewis's predicament that he had when he was young is still ours. He found an antidote to this sense of the universe as this vast wasteland by studying medieval literature. And he actually would like us to perform an experiment, which is based on his own study of medieval cosmology. The experiment is, I wonder if Michael Ward talked about this, go out at night and look up at the sky and try to imagine what it would have looked like through medieval eyes. I mean, one of the best things you can do if you're trying to get out from a kind of narrow, pinched worldview that you feel stuck in is to try to look at the world through the eyes of other people. Not just study them, but study what the world looks like through their eyes. Okay, so you're going to go out at night and look up at the sky. And what you're going to see is a vast universe. The medieval universe, despite Richard Dawkins saying that it was pokey, wasn't pokey, it was huge, it was vast. It was just as awe-inspiring as what we see through space telescopes, but it had an intelligible structure. It told a story, a human story. It looked like a building, like a great cathedral, rather than a trackless expanse. And that sight is both exalting and humbling. So Lewis thought there had to be a way, without rejecting modern science, to recover. This is this work of recovery that he and Tolkien were both involved in, to recover what was essential to the medieval model. He knows we can't step back to a Ptolemaic universe, but he's convinced that it must be possible to imagine the universe as an organic whole, teeming with life and intelligence, knit together by an inner telos, that is a drive towards a purpose, as a cosmic order whose microcosm we are, the rational creature, made in the image and likeness of God, and in our world marred, harmed, distorted, messed up by the fall, but restored by the deifying light. Lewis is convinced that there's no achievement of genuine science that can render this model obsolete. It's only this sort of crude scientism, which isn't science, it's bad philosophy, which makes it seem so. And this crude scientism is just a failure of imagination, really, which is why imaginative literature can help cure us. And that's what Lewis set out to do in his first work of so-called scientific fiction. He took as his model H.G. Wells's anti-imperialist novel, First Men on the Moon, to write Out of the Silent Planet on a kind of dare with Tolkien. Tolkien actually didn't fulfill his end of the bargain, but Lewis did. And it was the first of what would become the space trilogy. In the Out of the Silent Planet, outer space becomes deep heaven, a realm saturated with being, with the planetary spheres as more like just depressions in that light. And every planet is in the custody of a god, a tutelary spirit, called an oyarsa, which is a play on the Greek word ousiar, first being. Our myths know them as the gods, Mars, Venus, Mercury, the personifications of their own planets. Our own world, which is the silent planet, has been deformed and blockaded, however, because our oyarsa is the rebel, the fallen oyarsa. And our world is wounded still further by the primordial disobedience of our own kind. And yet, O felix culpa, as the liturgy says, happy fault, it was ransomed by the incarnate, crucified, and risen Lord. So we have a world under siege, a fallen world, but not a forsaken world. Well, according to the space trilogy, in the Out of the Silent Planet, it turns out that our ruling demon has designs on other worlds and other races than our own. And the task of thwarting those designs falls to a Tolkien-esque Cambridge philologist on holiday named Elwyn Ransom, who's kidnapped by a brilliant physicist named Weston and a venal industrialist embarked on a colonizing mission to Mars. So the lead character, Ransom's first experience of space travel immerses us in Lewis's medieval model. He feels this starlight stabbing into, there's a very kind of a very sensuous language here. Like the story of, rather actually a rape by Zeus story, but anyway, he said it made it impossible to disbelieve in the old astrology. He felt sweet influence pouring into his surrendered body. So it's very sensual. And that's because Lewis will not have us imagine the heavens as places of disembodied abstraction. As he takes his first steps on Mars, Ransom has another prejudice to overcome. He expects the aliens to be monstrous, insectoid-type beings. And his awakening begins when he finds that the first alien he meets possesses language, and that all three Martian races are language bearers, in which, hence, in our parochial sense of the word, they are human. That is, they possess now, which is a play on the Greek nous, however you pronounce it, nous. They're intelligent beings who have a spiritual soul, which is the seat of rationality and love, that soul which ascends to its maker upon its bodily death. That's basically the message of Out of the Silent Planet. We should be able to recognize ourselves in these beings who are of a different species, and therefore recognize our humanity and its possibilities when we look back at our own. Lewis wrote the sequel, Perelandra, while he was he was in the middle of a critical debate about Milton's Paradise Lost, great epic of sin and salvation. And the question that the critics were debating was whether Milton had made it plausible, had made the fall of man plausible. Because here's the problem. You have a perfectly innocent being. How is it possible for anyone to ruin such a perfectly innocent being? How could the temptation really take effect? So to test this question, Lewis recast the story and set it on Venus, which would be a young planet at the Adam and Eve stage, give us a perfectly innocent Eve, whose own virtues provide the entry point for the flattering wiles and half-truths of a demonically possessed Weston. And Ransom discovers that his job is a fight to the death with Weston, now called the Unman, the former brilliant physicist who started out as an idealist. So while he's struggling in a death grip with Weston, he has a realization, which is another Lewis maxim. Basically, this is Lewis's story about where we're headed in terms of the future life. It goes like this. As there is one face above all worlds, merely to see which is irrevocable joy, so at the bottom of all worlds, that face is waiting, whose sight alone is the misery from which none who beholds it can recover. And though there seemed to be, and indeed were, 1,000 roads by which a man could walk through the world, there was not a single one which did not lead sooner or later either to the beatific or the miserific vision. One way or the other, we're going to be gods or we're going to be unman. And each of the Space Trilogy novels maps this road to the beatific or miserific vision. We see Weston, as I said, idealistic at the start, increasingly unmindful of the now, the humanity of strangers or aliens, and then drawn into a kind of ersatz mysticism and ultimately demonically possessed as he surrenders his own humanity. In That Hideous Strength, the third of the Space Trilogy novels, it's an academic satire which owes a lot to the so-called supernatural shockers of Lewis's friend Charles Williams. We meet a young sociologist who's so desperate to be accepted into what's called the progressive element that he allows himself to be recruited for a satanic social engineering project from which he's liberated only by the intervention of Ransom's secret Arthurian fellowship. And then there's this extravagant ending where you get an in-person visitation from the Oyarses, the planetary gods, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter. They all come down here to the silent planet, which is telling us that the siege of our fallen world is coming to an end. So it's an extravagant fantasy. So you're thinking, what? This is the guy you said had restraint? But the thing is, even with this sort of over-the-top apocalyptic ending, where Merlin is involved and he causes all the bad guys, basically, to lose language and it turns into babble, and it's hilarious and it's really over the top. But that's not, it doesn't inflame our speculative curiosity. It wouldn't have helped my grandmother's best friend cook up ideas about an afterlife. In fact, what one remembers from all of this isn't so much the visionary fireworks as the psychology of damnation. Lewis is just a genius at this, depicting the slow, almost imperceptible steps, the small compromises, the alternating bouts of self-aggrandizement and self-pity which lead to the miserific vision. That some human beings will end in the miserific vision is an idea that Lewis says he finds intolerable, but he's not willing to reject. He's pretty insistent on this point. There's a whole chapter on hell in his first book of Christian apologetics after his conversion, a book called The Problem of Pain, in which he says, I would pay any price to be able to say truthfully, all will be saved. But my reason retorts, without their will or with it? If I say without their will, I at once perceive a contradiction. How can the supreme voluntary act of self-surrender be involuntary? If I say with their will, my reason replies, how if they will not give in? In other words, he's saying it has to be possible, given freedom, it has to be possible for anyone to reject every offer of salvation. And not even an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God can change that. The famous saying, often quoted from Lewis, hell is locked on the inside. So, a lot of Lewis fans part company with him on this point. And the arguments pro and con universal salvation can actually get kind of tiresome, especially when they lead to mutual anathemas on Twitter. But as I said, Lewis's genius is capturing the psychology of the descent. I mean, who can forget the spectacle of Napoleon in The Great Divorce? He's in this thought-built empire-style mansion in hell, basically. He's pacing back and forth and muttering to himself, it was Sull's fault, it was Ney's fault, it was Josephine's fault, it was the fault of the Russians, it was the fault of the English. And he's repeating this over and over again. And no one can stop him without destroying the freedom in which he was made. But that freedom has become his imprisonment. The premise of The Great Divorce is that the unsettled dead, ghosts, though they realize it not, but that's a kind of convention of spiritualist literature. during the heyday of mediums and on seances and stuff, they would have these rescue circles to contact the dead, and the first thing you had to do was tell them they're dead. They don't know it. But anyway, in the Great Divorce, you have these ghosts. They have a chance to be made fit for heaven. And there's this resplendent bus that transports them from this gray town to which they've been assigned at death to this verdant land, a land which is so lush, so real that the grass cuts their feet because they're not solid. And there they are met by bright spirits who had known them in life and who offer them one last chance to let go of their obsessive self-projects and to surrender to joy. And so you have this self-important bishop who says, of course, I should require some assurances. I should want a guarantee that you are taking me to a place where I shall find a wider sphere of usefulness. But there are no such guarantees. One must be remade, and that is painful, that de-dragoning. And almost everyone, not everyone, fortunately, but almost everyone holds fast to their sins and declines this offer of remediation and refuses this promised joy and say, it's facile, it's all too easy, or it's an insult to my dignity, and they return to the gray town to be consumed by their resentments. In fact, we were talking earlier today about the four loves, and this is relevant. The easiest sin to cure, Lewis says, is lust. That's much less problematic than envy or pride, much more capable of submitting to that death and resurrection that all our natural loves have to undergo. So then he hears the voice of George MacDonald, the beloved Scottish theologian. And in life, and in fact in the way he's read today, MacDonald had been a universalist who says, every soul that is ultimately lost is a defeat of the love of God. But the fictional MacDonald is a little modified, let's say, by Lewis, the author, who's in control here. It's a fictional MacDonald and a fictional Lewis. And MacDonald becomes the Virgil to Lewis, as in the Divine Comedy. Lewis becomes a rather hapless Dante, I guess. He echoes this maxim of restraint. He'll say this much: to those who elect to remain in the verdant land, that gray town will have been purgatory. But to those who are bent on returning to the gray town, it will have been hell even from the beginning. And just as heaven works backwards, turning all past suffering into glory, which is interesting. I've got to stop here for a second and just tell you about something I've been reading recently. A Jewish philosopher named Samuel Levins and another one, Tyrone Goldschmidt. Right. They think they have a solution to the problem of evil, which has to do with God changing the past. Once we're all in heaven or in the risen life, God can change the past. Okay, I'm not sure if this is what Lewis has in mind, but I'm just so interested in that idea. Anyway, heaven works backwards, anyway, at least turning past suffering into glory. So hell works backwards and turns all past pleasures into ash, so that at the end of things, the blessed will say, we have never lived anywhere except in heaven, and the lost will say, we were always in hell. But the thing about hell, and this is Lewis's Christian Platonism at work. The Platonic idea of evil is that it's basically nothing. It's deprivation of good. Everything that exists, insofar as it has a share in existence, is good. So what could hell be like? It's smaller than an atom. The damned soul fits into hell by being nearly nothing, because that's what it's like to be damned. It's to shrink down and be shut into yourself. It's nearly nothing, but here again is Lewis's restraint. He's not going to become an out-and-out annihilationist. He's going to say nearly nothing, but he's not going to endorse a non-mainstream, non-authorized teaching, as tempting as it might be to his Platonism. And when it comes to this universalism question, what MacDonald says is, fictional Lewis, you were not brought here to study such curiosities. What concerns you is not, speculating about what's happening to various souls, what's happening to Hitler, Napoleon, or or your next door neighbor. What concerns you, MacDonald says, the fictional MacDonald says, what concerns you is the nature of the choice itself, and that you can watch them making. So the nature of the choice, the ordering and disordering of love, that was what really concerned Lewis. In the same way, I can't think of any modern Christian authors who have succeeded so completely in making that journey toward the beatific vision, toward blessedness, rationally plausible and imaginatively real. In his lay sermons, the sermons that led the Times of London to call him Oxford's modern Newman, he showed how this can be done. I'm just going to mention my two favorite, which are among the more famous ones. One is The Weight of Glory, which Lewis preached in June 1941 during solemn evensong at Oxford's Church of St. Mary the Virgin, which, by the way, has great chocolate cake if you go to their cafe when you're there. He says, we are promised something called glory, which we hardly dare to desire. It's just too good for us to wrap our minds around it. And yet that's what we're made for, and that's our inconsolable secret. Our imagination in this regard is not too strong, as many liberal theologians have believed, but too weak. We should expect heaven to be more concrete, more sensuous than our wildest dreams. And so the wealth of imagery that Scripture gives us for heaven, the wedding feast, the jeweled gates, the astral splendor, is not improved upon by vague or more spiritual sounding abstractions. And then in my absolute favorite piece of Lewis writing, Transposition, a Pentecost sermon that he preached to a Congregationalist chapel at Mansfield College, he develops this principle with extraordinary success. So he begins with this problem of sensual imagery. He says, in talking about the original Pentecost experience of the descent of the Holy Spirit on the disciples, and also at glossolalia, speaking in tongues, all that sort of thing. He says, if we have really been visited by a revelation from beyond nature, is it not very strange that an apocalypse can furnish heaven with nothing more than selections from terrestrial experience, like crowns and thrones and music, that devotion can find no language but that of human lovers, and that the rite whereby Christians enact a mystical union should turn out to be only the old familiar act of eating and drinking? So Freud could make quick work of all this imagery, but Lewis has an alternative explanation. From an entry in the 17th century diary of Samuel Pepys, spelled P-E-P-Y-S, you can follow this diary on Twitter in installments. Reason for me on Twitter, along with the puppies. Lewis teases out a fantastic answer to this problem. Pepys records 2 episodes of nausea, one associated with seasickness and the other with falling in love. One regrettable, the other enchanting. And Lewis says, look, it seems that we have a limited repertoire of sensations with which to register an almost unlimited range of affective states. So a sensation like a flutter in the diaphragm can accompany seasickness or fear or aesthetic rapture or romantic love. In each case, the flutter in the diaphragm does not interpret itself, but receives its meaning from the emotion that it registers. So the higher state interprets the lower. The richer vocabulary of emotion interprets the poorer vocabulary of sensation, and the full experience can be understood from the higher vantage point alone. I'm getting to heaven with this, don't worry. This is about qualia. This is the emotion, he says, descends into the sensation and is transubstantiated, so that the same thrill along the nerves is delight or agony. So this is an argument, at first, just could be used as an argument against a physicalist reductionism, which says that all that's going on is the flutter in the diaphragm, which we then interpret as something else. But Lewis's subject is a supernatural life for which this relationship between sensation and emotion is just an analogy. Our present natural life, he says, will prove to have been the diminution, the symbol, the etiolated, the vegetarian substitute for the real banquet. Now, he refers to a Victorian satirical novel called Flatland, a romance of many dimensions, which is set in a two-dimensional world, where you have two-dimensional beings. And Lewis goes on to says, imagine you're a two-dimensional being and someone's trying to use perspective and draw a picture of a road, and you look at it, it's on this flat piece of paper, and you see the two lines, and someone tells you, this is actually a road, and you say, you keep telling me of this other world and its unimaginable shapes, which you call solid. But isn't it very suspicious that all the shapes which you offer me as images or reflections of the solid ones turn out on inspection to be simply the old two-dimensional shapes of my own world as I've always known it? Isn't it obvious that your vaunted other world, so far from being the archetype, is a dream which borrows all its elements from this one? So, you know, when you try to draw a picture of a road going somewhere, you end up with something which, could be interpreted as I think he says, as a dunce cap, right? Could be many things. But this is the message our culture is feeding us incessantly until we internalize it and say such things to ourselves. Surely our vaunted other world is a dream which just borrows its elements from this world. Lewis then applies this line of thinking, this transposition principle, to all the core mysteries of the faith, to the incarnation, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost, and so on. At one point in the sermon, actually, Lewis was overcome with emotion, and the choir had to sing a hymn while he collected himself. I don't know if you followed everything I said about the you have to go and read transposition. You can find it on the internet. But these two sermons, The Weight of Glory and Transposition, what I love about them, what I marvel at with them, is how they contain nearly all of Lewis's major religious and eschatological themes, which are the unquenchable desire that tells us that we are made for heaven, and our habitual misdirection of this desire toward merely proximate goods, which are good in their own place, what he calls the solemn merriment that characterizes Christian life, the realization that there are no ordinary people, that we are all immortals walking around, whose mortal pilgrimage will end in either the beatific or the miserific vision. I mean, once you see this in Lewis, you just start to, once you pick it up in one piece of Lewis, you start to see it in all of them. This idea that the spiritual life is more concrete, not less concrete than our sensory life here below. It's more sensory, in a way, than our senses. Our senses are the shadows of real full sensing. That heaven is more solid than earth. That the life of the world to come will be a robust and full life of which our present life is a vegetarian substitute. We're living on tofu here below. We will have the real meat in heaven. And once you see this theme in Lewis, you can kind of connect the Lewis who loved the nude bathing and the beef and beer with the Lewis of mere Christianity. Is a total picture of the cosmos. So within which he's taking on these sometimes controversial questions and advancing our conversation, but without trying to innovate too much. So on hell, he steers close to the mainstream orthodox and scriptural position. There's just a slight tinge of Balthasar-like hope, if only in the insistence on reining in our curiosity. It's not really our business what's going to happen to others. We've got to work on our journey towards the beatific or miserific vision. On the bodily resurrection, Lewis is magnificent. So if you read Perelandra, there's this great encounter where Ransom, having just come back from Venus, is trying to explain to a skeptical friend, McPhee, and to his dull-witted friend, the fictional Lewis, about what he experienced there and about how it relates to the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. And so McPhee says, so you think I can't do the Scottish accent, but so you think you're going to have guts and palate forever in a world where there will be no eating and genital organs in a world without copulation? Man, you'll have a grand time of it. And then Ransom bursts out and says, oh, don't you see, you ass? There's a difference between a trans-sensuous life and a non-sensuous life. He says that the functions and appetites of the body won't atrophy. They'll be engulfed. They'll be raised up along the lines that he discusses, that he explains most clearly, I think, in Transposition. Another point, as I said, Lewis is a Christian Platonist. You know, in The Last Battle, Diggory Kirk says, it's all in Plato, all in Plato. Bless me, what do they teach them in these schools? In this school, you do teach Plato, okay? The thing is, some people think that that we have to choose between two competing rival paradigms about the human destiny after death. The immortality of the soul versus resurrection, bodily resurrection of the dead, that these are incompatible models. That idea was being pushed very hard in Lewis's day and continued, and maybe it's fizzling out a bit, but I think it's still with us. The thing is, he remains solidly within his tradition. He's a firm believer in this two-stage eschatology where you have an intermediate period of a discarnate soul, and then you have a bodily resurrection, not a resurrection in death, but a resurrection with the second coming, who knows when, at the end of time. The thing is, what helped him here was his literary erudition. He was too well read in classical and medieval secular and religious literature, in Anglican liturgy to some extent. He wasn't great on hymns, but in the Bible itself, to buy into this very facile polarization. In this respect, and in many others, he agrees very strongly with current Catholic positions, such as are presented in the 1979 letter on eschatology, which affirms at once the survival of the soul after death and the resurrection of the whole person, and rejects language which would make meaningless or unintelligible what we do with the dead, and prayer for the dead, and all of that. Now, with purgatory, it's really interesting. I would say this sounds very Catholic, right? Lewis saying our souls need purgatory, as he says in letters to Malcolm. But it really wasn't. This is perfect Anglicanism in Lewis. The thing is that the Tudor Church had condemned the doctrine of purgatory in the 39 Articles of Religion as a fond thing, vainly invented, and grounded upon no warranty of Scripture, but rather repugnant to the Word of God. But purgatory, or at least its analogs, went underground in a way and survived in the English literary imagination, in John Donne, in Pilgrim's Progress, in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, and of course in Newman's Dream of Gerontius, the great purgatory poem, and also in T.S. Eliot's Ash Wednesday, 4 quartets. Something like purgatory couldn't be abolished in the English imagination. It was just too beautiful and too inescapable, I guess. In 1947, Lewis received a fan letter from an Italian Catholic priest who was actually later canonized, Giovanni Calabria. They corresponded in Latin. It's the only language they had in common. And there Lewis talks to Calabria about how they should pray for one another, and not even, because I think he thought Calabria had died, and then found out he hadn't. He said, not even the river of death should stop us from praying for one another. Well, that used to be controversial, because prayer for the dead suggests that they're in a position to benefit from your prayer. If they're in a position to benefit from your prayer, that means they're not, just hell or just heaven. There's something going on that can improve their condition. Lewis likes that idea. He doesn't like other Romish elaborations of it in some ways, or practices associated with it, but he thinks this is really a really important idea. But he wasn't so much straying into Catholic waters as reflecting a sea change in Anglican thought. In the aftermath of the First World War, when so many were mowed down, young men, there was an Anglican doctrinal commission that directed pastors and theologians to encourage prayer for the dead, to overcome that scruple, and to speak of the interim period after death as a time of growth and purification. And this idea, the de-dragoning that purgatory is, a de-infernalized purgatory, is what Lewis took on and expressed in so many different ways. He loved Newman's Dream of Gerontius, the idea of purgatory here that you find in Newman, in Dante, in purgatory mystics like the 16th century Saint Catherine of Genoa, purgatory, and also in Pope Benedict and his encyclical on hope, Spe Salvi. Purgatory here isn't hell light, and there's no trapdoor that leads down to hell from purgatory. It's an antechamber of heaven, and if it's got fiery imagery in it, that fire is not destructive fire. It's an encounter with the fire of divine love, which burns only to heal. This is the purgatory that Lewis endorses and really depicts for us, because as has always been thought in Christian tradition, purgatory isn't so much a place as a process, and it begins in this life. Finally, with regard to the second coming and the events of the Last Judgment, again, Lewis is restrained. He says, this is in The World's Last Night, the doctrine of the second coming teaches us that we do not and cannot know when the world drama will end. That it will come when it ought, we may be sure, but we waste our time in guessing when it will be. And that we should be thinking about the Last Judgment as it is addressed to our conscience, not to our vain curiosity. He says it will be infallible judgment. If it is favorable, we shall have no fear. If unfavorable, no hope that it is wrong. You know, this concept, if I just talked about Lewis and the road to the miserific vision all the time, it would sound like he was just hectoring us. There are moments when I feel that a little bit from Lewis, but mainly, he does think we're at risk, all of us. He does think that it's a real possibility that, as he puts it, the inveterate grumbler could just become a grumble and nothing else. But he wants us also to take heart in the promise of a future so glorious that to our flatlander, tofu-eating imaginations, it looks like it's too good to be true. And on that score, at least, no restraint is needed, because here are worlds of blessedness than which no greater can be conceived.
We have about, thank you so much again. We have about 15 or 20 minutes for questions, and it is the custom of the Humanities Forum to have a student ask the first question. So do we have a student question out there? Don't be shy.
The thing they teach you as a teacher is to tolerate that silence when you first ask for a question, because people need to, process things. And you're processing heaven, hell, and purgatory. That's a lot.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
I had a class, so I came in a little late. I don't know if you talked about this before, and I don't know if if this is like a common knowledge, but is MacDonald that you were talking about someone who was actually alive like Virgil, or was he a fictional character in Lewis's book?
He's fictional in Lewis, but he's a real person who was a great influence on Lewis and who wrote fairy tales and kind of Scottish regional fiction, and got in a little trouble with his congregation for teaching what looked very much like a doctrine of universal salvation, and basically had to give up and devote himself and his wonderful, huge family to writing spiritual works and works of fiction, fantasy. He was a huge influence on C.S. Lewis.
Thank you so much for being here and for an awesome talk. I'm not sure to what extent the phenomenon of moralistic therapeutic deism that a lot of us think a lot about as we try to reach our students. I'm assuming that people in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, that wouldn't be their particular problem. But so I'm thinking about the tenet of moralistic therapeutic deism, good people go to heaven when they die, as the kind of common understanding that many people have, sort of developed and vague. How might Lewis speak to a young person today about that sort of vague, good people go to heaven when they die, and that's about as much as they think about heaven?
Well, you know, in some ways, he's showing us good people going to heaven when they die. Like the character of Sarah Smith. I think she's Jewish, you know? Do you think that? Because she comes from Golders Green, which was a mainly Jewish neighborhood. She's, you know, an exalted being who comes in at the end of the Great Divorce. It was her goodness, her compassion, her humility. But where did all those good traits come from? Obviously, there's grace involved, and openness to grace, surrender, obedience. He uses words like that, which suggest that it isn't just a matter of coming up with a program of self-improvement, self-perfection, following that program, you know, you're getting your Apple Watch to give you feedback on how you're doing as you develop more and more virtues. He wouldn't go with that, but there is a sense that, you know, also at the end of the last battle, there's an interesting thing that happens there. In some ways, he's satirizing another common thing that I think goes together with moral therapeutic deism, which is the idea that Tash and Aslan are one, right? There's all these different gods, and they must be one. And in the end, we'll have the revelation that we've all been worshiping the same God. That's rejected in the last battle. On the other hand, so no metaphysical inclusivism in the last battle. On the other hand, there is soteriological inclusivism, which is that those who are good, the pure of heart, who are devoted to Tash, will be accepted by Aslan, as if they were giving that devotion to him. So I have a feeling this is a complicated question, that he's very moralistic in a lot of ways, but on the other hand, he wants to emphasize grace and allowing it to take you over in a way, to be possessed in a way by it, infused by it at least, if not possessed. That's an interesting question.
Hi, thank you for coming. I grew up Pentecostal, and I was kind of just wondering, how do you think Lewis reconciles that idea of it just means you're a good person, like it's just you being a good person, with that, like, unfortunately very Pentecostal idea of, like, it is not good person, it is good work. You know what I mean? Like, it's the action, not the person. Do you know what I'm saying?
Action reveals the person, I think he would say. So I'm not sure he would separate them too much. But his response to Pentecostalism is interesting. If you read the beginning of Transposition, he says that the phenomena, you know, the charismatic sort of phenomenon of especially speaking in tongues, he admits to finding that embarrassing. It's not in his background. But on the other hand, he's not going to rule it out, because he certainly doesn't rule it out at the first Pentecost, which is the birth of the church, and he's not going to rule it out, but he's going to try to understand it in terms of this principle of transposition. You might find that interesting. But I think, I don't think he would separate the person from the acts that the person performs, if I'm understanding correctly what you're asking.
Thank you so much for being with us. My Civ, Development of Western Civilization class, we just finished reading Dante's portions of Dante's Divine Comedy, and we discussed together the contrapasso and, you know, how it is that Dante's creatively revealing to us the nature of sin. And so would you have anything, insights you could share about maybe that element of the Divine Comedy, the contrapasso, that is evident in Lewis's work, and maybe with some examples for us?
I'd love to give examples. So I don't know if you all know what contrapasso is. It's a special thing that we think of as Dante's invention in a way, where but I think there are other examples of it in world religions, actually, where the sinner receives a punishment, which is kind of like the symbolic acting out of the sin. I'm drawing a blank on examples, but they do exist. I mean, I think in the Great Divorce we would find them. I remember even writing down in the margin, contrapasso here, contrapasso there. But I can't think of the examples. But like in Dante, the ones that go back, walking backwards, which were the prognosticators of the future, and they're.
Well, I'm thinking of from
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Depicting something about the nature of.
Right. Right. The lizard. Yes, that's great. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like I need to think more about how that really functions as contrapasso, but I had that same impression. I'm sure he's consciously thinking in terms of it. The punishment should fit the crime, not just in a sort of juridical sense, but in the sense that that the crime itself is the punishment. And so living it out to its fullest extent is best represented through these kinds of symbolic means, like the grumbler becoming a grumble. Yeah. So I'm really excited about the purgatory stuff, and partly because there has been this rapprochement in terms of kind of ecumenical reconciliation, where you have Anglicans accepting purgatory, and then Lutherans accepting purgatory, at least the Finnish Lutherans. There was a joint declaration after the one on justification by faith where they decided, once we really look at it and, get past certain stumbling blocks, it looks like we're interested in the same thing, some process of sanctification that could happen after death.
Hi, thank you. Whoa, this is a little loud. Thank you for being here. I'm wondering what Lewis would make of the natural tendency of man. Does he think that man is, inclined to do evil at first, or does he think that man is naturally good? And what does he say? Are we corrupted by our own desire, or are we corrupted by each other, or what does he make of that?
Thank you for being here. Well, yes, he thinks that we are corrupted that we're damaged goods in a way, but that we also have within us, we're not totally damaged, we're not totally ruined. Our reason still functions. I mean, there have been some Christians who have thought that the damage of the fall was so great that our reason cannot be used as any sort of aid to comprehending God or doing kind of moral reasoning, so he thinks that we're damaged but not wholly destroyed by the fall. And that desire, as you mentioned, is really the sort of motive force, that our desires make us who we are. And our desires are, to lesser or greater extent, disordered, but capable of repair. And that work of repair, of course, is the atonement, and then the experiencing of the fruits of that atonement. It's just that it's still somewhat of a work in progress.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask you about taste, because early in your lecture you had a phrase about Lewis's taste for things as you described it, and I'm trying to put together taste with imagination and desire. And so I'd just love to hear anything you have to say about sensibility or taste, and if that's too vague, I would ask you as from your teaching, what kinds of tastes or sensibilities and affinities that your students have that you try to latch on to, right? That's what I'm asking about, because you could say that desire is natural, and imagination we can kind of tray, but people's tastes are kind of, they're already there. So what do you do, and what do you speak to? I'd be interested in that. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes in terms of teaching, I could maybe think about it. Sometimes what seems to work, and at least in a classroom setting for me, is asking people what they think about their tastes and the fact that they don't all have the same taste. Is there some sort of objective beauty? Is it, if we were immersed in some beautiful work of art or beautiful scenery or beautiful building or something, should we take that to mean something? Should we draw some inference from that to some set of beliefs about the goodness of the world or even about God? So I think where I teach, I can't assume anything in terms of what people's beliefs are, and also, of course, the variety of literary aesthetic taste is all over the place. So I think the only way that has worked for me is to start by just exploring that. I think Lewis also warns against making too much of a fetish of taste, and especially, in a way, weaponizing that so that you're trying to use the tools of the craft of art or of criticism of art or of literature to just be didactic. That's the discussion in Abolition of Man.
Right. If I could ask the last question, and it comes from Tim Flanagan. He told me I could blame him. He was wondering, did Lewis have any influence on you embracing Christianity, or did you discover him afterwards? And if you wouldn't mind talking about that, that would be
I
great.
wouldn't mind talking. I come from a totally secular background. The first Christians I ever met were Catholic workers, actually, because of my high school teacher said, hey, I grew up in New York, there's this Catholic worker house, why don't you do a report on them? So I went and did a report on them, and I even, for show and tell, I brought one of them to class. And I was pretty impressed. But when I read Lewis, which was much later, I think in college, the main impact it had was, oh, that's what I always thought, that feeling. But I had read Augustine before I read Lewis. And I'd read Plato before I read Lewis, and it's all in Plato. Yeah. Before that, I read the Pre-Socratics. I think that sense of imagination, of being able to put yourself in the universe as depicted by any one of these thinkers, is tremendously freeing. And then once you've freed yourself from the way we've pictured our universe right now, you can come back into our universe and discover that that it's open to these other possibilities. So Lewis wasn't so much of an influence as a confirmation for me.
All right, before we thank Dr. Zaleski one more time, the conversation doesn't have to end here. We do have a reception.